Hey everybody, my name is Alex and this is Bento Radio. Now before we get started, I want to shout out a new article I've got over on bento-box.ghost.io, which there will always be when I talk about this stuff, a QR code up on screen somewhere. I'm thinking probably on the right side of me. But this article is all about money and anime, considering I was just at, probably a month, well not just at, but a month ago I was at Anime NYC and in the dealer's room and seeing the prices of things. It got me thinking about all the tariffs and the import taxes and the de minimis exemptions that are all being messed with right now, and I started thinking about money and anime, and I wrote an article about anime that focuses either partly or entirely on money. So go check that out over on bento-box.ghost.io. You can also find all the different places to find me. So if you're listening to this and you would like to be watching this, or vice versa, you can find links to the audio version of the podcast and links to the video version of the podcast over on YouTube, also over there. So go check that out. And now without further ado, let's jump into what we're talking about this week. And that is a show from actually this season. I'm surprised I'm doing it this early too. Don't you worry, but you'll see why in a second. So let's toss it over to my lovely assistant I for a synopsis of this week's show. And that is synopsis of Tougen Anki. Take it away, I.
Long ago, demon-like creatures known as Oni butchered humans and brought on destruction solely for their own delight. A lone man named Momotaro opposed these gruesome, near-invincible monsters, but the war against them was just beginning. Thousands of years in the future, temperamental gun enthusiast Shiki Ichinose leads a carefree life. However, after his expulsion from school, everything changes. Shiki is suddenly attacked by a man and is rescued by his adoptive father, Tsuyoshi. As the two flee, Tsuyoshi reveals that Shiki is actually a descendant of the Oni, while both he and their pursuer are from the Momotaro lineage. The two Momotaro soon clash in a fierce battle, and Tsuyoshi sacrifices himself to protect Shiki. Devastated, Shiki awakens to his Oni blood that grants him immense strength at the cost of going berserk. Although the enemy escapes, Naito Mudano, an Oni teacher at Resetsu Academy, takes an interest in Shiki. Under Mudano's guidance, Shiki must learn to control the Oni blood, if he ever hopes to avenge his father.
Now, before we jump into my direct thoughts about Tougen Anki, I want to set the stage here with a little bit of a long tale. Not so much that it's the entire podcast, I promise. But a couple years ago in 2000, I want to say 2016, but it feels earlier than that. Whenever Black Clover came out, I sat down to watch the first episode of Black Clover, and I came away from it perplexed, as I'm sure a lot of people who are well versed in shonen anime and the Shonen Jump formula and the way those shows were, because everything about Black Clover to me is from a different show, and this isn't uncommon, but Black Clover, at least for me, was the first time I watched something and it felt truly derivative of the form. So I was in a little bit of shock. Not just for that reason, but we'll get to the second reason in a minute, that Asta didn't seem terribly original. He seemed a lot like Naruto. That the Wizard King seemed a lot like the Hokage. That the setting felt a lot like a cross between Fairy Tail and Harry Potter. And not that surprised me, it's just mostly that I wasn't here for it. And hilariously, even though I wasn't here for it, I did end up watching it for about 103, 106 episodes a week. You'll find out from this, have a thing with bad stuff. Sometimes I just watch a bad thing for a while. I have a long and storied history of watching Blade for that reason. But the thing of it was is that there was still like a heart there. But there were also like there were odd choices. So if you look at all of the look at the big four. If you look at Naruto, Bleach, One Piece, and actually really not Dragon Ball Z now that I think about it. But if you look at those three of the big four, Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, there's a point in each of those shows where the kind of sex jokes and ecchi stuff just kind of in there. You can take it or leave it. It's part of the show, but it doesn't have to be. Sexy Jutsu is a perfect example. The Kakashi reads and the Jiraiya writes are a perfect example. Jiraiya is a perfect example. In Bleach, Ranjiku is a perfect example. Like, the only character who looks like that. Do some stuff with Yoriichi, jokes in there, in that vein. And then you look at post-time skip character designs for One Piece of basically any female character. They all go from being like appropriate, with the exception of Robin, who's like to be a like damsel when you encounter her in after the first time, but also like is at all times said to be of age. But you look at like post-time skip design, and she goes from being like a very sporty t-shirt and like skirt to being full on in a bikini top and like fucking jeans. You don't have to look hard. But then you move it kind of 1 degree removed to something like Black Clover. And in Black Clover, you get the egregious episode 1 harassment of Sister Lily. And and that show goes even farther to like only being defined in some cases in the relations to another male character. The character, I forget her name, I think it might be not Formosa, essentially hangs out in red lingerie for much of her highlights. There's Noelle's like armor bikini water saying power up. You can exist alongside it, but it's like the male gaze sexism is clearly like the dial has been turned up in that show. And Ashta's pure sexual harassment of a nun in that show, in the first episode, is upsetting. Like, it's presented as charming and quirky. It's not. And I mentioned that specifically for a reason, but we'll get to that in a second. But the whole show seems like an amalgamation of other things. Now, you watch the show for long enough, and it starts to get really away from that, and it starts to prove that, like, the premise and settings and setups of the show are very rooted in what came before, but the, like, it takes feels unique enough where you can latch on to stuff in Black Clover's case. Now, fast forward to 2025 on Netflix, and we have Tougen Anki. The problem with Tougen Anki is that it doesn't really have much original outside of only part of its primary premise, and we'll get to why that is in a second. Everything in the initial part, this first season of Tougen Anki, is something you've seen before elsewhere. This is a big point, actually, in they talk about all the time over on the Otaku's Anonymous podcast, where they are enjoying, and I'm enjoying watching Tougen Anki for what it is, but it's not original. Like, you shouldn't ever fool yourself into thinking it's original. It's also actively bad. That goes back to me saying the thing that I would just like to watch the bad thing. I like to turn my head off and watch the bad action thing. The originality problem is a big problem in Tougen Anki because nothing feels wholly formed for this show. Start with the original premise. It's starting with the premise of, as you heard in the of the Momotaro versus the Oni. The Momotaro are very Yakuza, not Yakuza the game, but Yakuza the actual, like, organization, in that they walk around in, like, white suits and jackets, and they look like loan sharks. I don't know what else to tell you. But they also kind of that a little bit, because later on in the show, you see kind of agency, and they call them both agencies, which doesn't help. You see Oni agency lackeys, and Oni agency lackeys are just Yakuza, like level Yakuza henchmen. It's wild. And so they're borrowing those aesthetics. And the idea is that it's Oni versus the Momotaro because of, like, reasons. But then you have our main character, Shiki. And Shiki is the child of a famous Oni who survived longer than he should have. If that sounds familiar, that means congratulations. You've seen, I can't believe I zoomed myself out a little bit here, sorry. You've seen Blue Exorcist. Other parts of this seem familiar. That means you've seen anything from Naruto to Bleach to all of these different things. Almost everything that you see in this show, you can find in other things. From Shiki's obsession to guns, that looks an awful lot like the military otaku character from High School of the Dead, from kind of has something that exists somewhere else better. And that would be fine. You know, big thing in art. There's actually two things in art that I want to focus on here. Good artists borrow, great artists steal. Another thing is there's nothing new in the world. And that both of those go to the idea that, like, influenced by the things they've seen before, and everybody takes from things that they've seen all over the place. The background of this podcast in video form is based on, like, a very basic tatami room. My character is based off of a bunch of things. It's meant to look like me in real life, but it's informed by all these other things around it. The designs on both of those things are still original, but they are meant to evoke a different specific feelings by being specific things. So that's not uncommon, and I started this podcast out by talking about the Shonen formula. The Shonen formula is very specific. The Shonen Jump formula, rather, is very specific. It's a way to think about storytelling in Shonen action shows, specifically the kind that are in Shonen Jump. But the problem with Tougen Anki is, like, a random side character lets loose a Rasengan on our main character, because the side character is not even a villain, but a puppet of a villain, in the kind of corpse reanimating jutsu style of Shishomaru, face, from Naruto, uses a Rasengan on Shiki that is explained in exactly the way that Rasengans work. It starts to be a problem because none of this is presented with any, like, or awareness of why that stuff works. This show isn't at the same surface level as something like Naruto or Dragon Ball Z, or even something that's significantly lower down the, like, bro journey path as something like Blue Exorcist. You would almost certainly encounter those shows before you encountered this one. So what that necessarily means is, by the time you're watching the show, you've seen something like Naruto, you've seen something like Bleach, you've seen something like Blue Exorcist. And so you look at the show not with, like, eyes. You're not seeing these ideas for the first time. You're seeing these ideas as clear inspiration, as taking clear inspiration from other shows. Even the character named Yomogi, I'll get to this in a second. She's just a Ranjiku clone done worse, but her ability is essentially the same ability as, like, the fourth Mizukage as one of the Kage in later parts of Naruto Shippuden. She just makes cubes around shit. I don't know what to tell you. It feels like I feel insane. Like, you feel insane watching the show, because eventually you start watching it looking for things from other things. And then you get to the other half of the problem here. And that half of the problem is the show has that same problem I brought up with with Black Clover. And that problem is that it has that like over-sexualization problem. And I'm gonna relate this to a much better, super long-running shonen, not Black Clover, but Fairy Tail has this kind of flirtiness with ecchi that not many shows get right or balanced correctly. Like, female characters are allowed to be beautiful, allowed to be ogled, or allowed to be all that, but they doesn't feel as gross as something like harassing Sister Lily in Black Clover, or like character design in this show, or like his entire concept in this show. That's because the kind of flirtiness of Fairy Tail feels like it's something that the female cast might be aware of and might be putting out into the world, whereas so many of the female characters in this show, really with the exception maybe of Homura, but maybe she just hadn't had enough screen time. I grant it that. Defined by their relations to the male, whatever the male character, the closest male character is. So the entire time you're seeing in this show, she's accompanied by a second character, by kind of the main antagonist of much of the show. I forget his name, but this guy is portrayed as like and impressively evil the entire time. And as a result, I think his name is Morima Tsubaki. I think that's who I'm thinking of. But he's this kind of asshole of a character who you're meant to hate, who's designed for you to hate. It's very clear. He is the Gin from the Soul Society in Bleach. He is the Aizen kind of later, certainly. But he's dressed in the kind of white suit and getup that feels very classic based on what you've seen so far. Everybody gets a jacket with a fur collar, and everybody gets a suit. That's what you've been told for the entirety of the show up until now. And then standing next to him is a woman in a white suit, no jacket, only the black dress shirt underneath is open to the point where you can, open to the point where it must be taped in place because that's the only reason you're not seeing her nipples. And she's got, a shelf of a chest. And she's also eating a lollipop. It feels like when you first see her, that's really the first time you get this, we're doing this? Okay. Kunia's, comes later. But, not much later, but comes after that. But up until that point, the only female characters you've seen have been in school uniforms, have been appropriately dressed, and, this is a break of the show's form. This is, calling this out, it feels weird, because it is weird, but you kind of over it, and based on her, you think kind of, doing something darker here. They're already playing with, heavy metal imagery and all this stuff. Maybe this is part of it. You kind of in your head, because it's possible. And also the show is bad enough where you're like, okay. Then you see her ability, and her ability is basically making force field boxes around stuff. Nothing to do with why her whole chest is out. But okay, whatever. And then there's a scene on a boat where they're going to Kyoto, and you see Kunia in some detail for the first time. And they draw her kind of same way. Almost beat for beat. Got a shelf of a chest, cleavage for days. Start to notice the pattern. And then you get to Kunia's episodes, Kunia's highlight episodes where you see her fight. And boy, do they have her doing mixed martial arts in her underwear real quick. And deeply horny about it. And her motivation is deeply horny. In a show that's better, that commits to its own bits better, that is more thoughtful, this would make you less uncomfortable. In Bleach has kind of lurid eye towards at the very least 2 of its female characters. Certainly. 3. Yoriichi, and Orihime. But Orihime is less, she's more set up as a love interest. It's less about her body. It's more about, like, her and Ichigo eventually actually do end up together. But, like, Gag feels more contained. It feels certainly more contained to somebody like Ranjiku for the most part. It feels more like they're with paying homage to a Fujiko-like character in the show a little bit. If you don't know anything about Fujiko, like Lupin the Third, Fujiko is the character they make sex jokes about. But uncharacteristically, for a lot of other shows, she owns those jokes and like she plays those jokes more on Lupin than he does on her. And it's a whole like tactic on her part. So now you have this show that is not totally original. That like no part of it can be called original, but it's not working with the pieces that it's taking appropriately. Plus, you have this further like esque interpretation of the kind of that they put in these shows, mostly because Japanese male writers of the original properties who want to like joke, like the ninja novels in are like a running joke, are made like by Kishimoto later on in the show half-heartedly, but they're supposed to be a joke. You know, Sexy Jutsu is supposed to be a joke. Jiraiya is like called the pervy sage because it's part of the joke. But then you abstract it a little and you get Asta harassing Sister Lily. You extract it further and you get this. And once again, you mix that with the lack of originality. It's less the lack of originality and it's more the misunderstanding of why stuff like the Rasengan works in the context it's in. Why the like of the 13 court guard squads in works, because in Bleach kind of you get a definition of the 13 court guard squads as like we're supposed to expand beyond what you're seeing. They're not. You don't get the introduction to them that is explicitly evil. You get the introduction to them of like around and just like kind of governing force of the Soul Society at a moment. You get them like on roofs and thinking like fully around about shit. When Ichigo encounters them, they encountering them on their turf, and he's encountering them like coming at him. He's going to solve a problem, and they're like away. If that makes any sense, he's not being hunted at any point. The antagonistic part of it is they're following orders. He's trying to stop what they're trying to do from happening, but their heart isn't really in it. And so that goes the way it goes. The core conflict in most of the big three, in most of the big four's case, is malleable. The sides are swappable. You can go, like, in One Piece, become pirates, or become Marines, or part of the world government, but still don't have full allegiance to either side. Look at Toby, look at Helmeppo, look at Garp. And by making one side grayer and or both sides grayer, what you let happen is you let people get attached. If you let your audience get attached to characters who can then drift over to the other side, who could join the crew for like a mission or two and then leave. That's part of the genius of One Piece, is like the very top of the conflict is evil, world government, bad shit. But everything under that is movable somehow. You don't agree with everything. You know, and Toby, again, are like, they were saved by pirates. They have a respect for Luffy that would probably stop them from straight up fighting him if they felt they could. But this, and once again, in Bleach, the 13 Court Guard Squad, which are kind of the closest thing I think, to the, like, they're trying to set up with the Momotaro agency, they feel much more independent. They feel much less determined. And actually, a great interpretation of that is, you can see in another show this season that's leagues above this, it's wildly leagues above this, is you can see it in Gachi. In Gachiakuta, the initial thing that they're fighting is trash beasts. But almost immediately, trash beasts do not matter. It's just like, it's a stumbling block they arrive on. They find occasionally. They don't present much threat. They're disposed of pretty immediately. That's similar to hollows in Bleach. Like Bleach, the hollows are just kind of cannon fodder almost immediately in the same way. But they don't give you that kind of low-level evil here, where like the generalized low-level evil of the hollows is the thing that's unequivocally evil. Everybody wants to kill it. They set up direct conflict in a way that feels unmovable. So the structure that they build of the Momotaro agency, of the Oni agency, doesn't feel, at least right now, like even any ability for it to waver or people to cross sides and change. Because the Momotaro exist to eventually do a genocide on the Oni. And the Oni are just trying to live their lives. And that's a story you can tell, but the way they're doing this is so ham-fisted and so the way the story does it is so ham-fisted and so unskilled and so unoriginal that, like, left wanting more out of it constantly. Because if they had, this is like pie in the sky thing, they had Yomogi function kind of Momo from My Hero Academia, then her costume would make sense. Because, like, the deal with Momo is, like, yes, there's a lot of grossness around female character in My Hero. I'm not here to argue there isn't. Believe me, it is a problem. They are all underage. But at least they tried to veil Momo's costume with practicality. There's a scene in, like, second core of season 2 of Hero Academia where, like, have Sero basically wrap Mineta up like a mummy because Momo needs to make something big, so she's got to, like, turn and flash nobody, so she has the raw surface area to, like, get a speaker amp out of her body. Now, did they need to do it that way? Absolutely not. But they did, and they handled the joke with enough tact to get you past it. And in doing so, they gave you, like, clanche for why she's wearing a stripper outfit with a shelf and an encyclopedia over her butt. I'm not kidding. If you've never seen My Hero Academia, seriously, I'm not kidding. But Yomogi is just like, this is the choice she made. Like, and it feels less like her choice and more like a choice of character design. In Kunia's case, it feels like Kunia is here for this, like, because horny. But in Yomogi's case, it feels like the tail wagging the dog in the form of the author wanted to make something horny, but not let it be, but not give the character, like, agency in that. A perfect example of this is a much better show called Tyson Nobara in a fight with like delivery service wish from the, like, exam arcs that they do with their sister school. She has this whole monologue where she talks about, like, I love myself when I'm cute, I love myself when I'm sexy, I love myself when I'm the biggest bitch in the world, essentially. You can go look it up. It's a great scene. And later on in the show, they, like, down on that, and for the entire show, she is unapologetically herself. The camera treats her as, like, charged and in control of her own everything. But that's not what the show does here. It does it a little with Kunia, but Kunia is so amped up to 11 that, like, a different, like, wants to push over a guy who needs to be taken care of. And she gets that in the form of another character, but it's so... And I'll get to, I think it's a good thing about this show in a second, but Thinking about it now, it's parts of the show stand out so hard that it's just like astonishing. And once again, you don't have the quality of interpretation of the rest of it to lean back on, so that stands out more. If everything else about the show was top notch, and you had a character like Yomogi, or like, this would be a passing segment. I'd be like, okay, they're also. In the way that, like, it's a passing comment when most people talk about Bleach. But because it doesn't have the structure to support any of the rest of it, this part of it stands out and speaks really loudly. Now, I want to talk about what I think is the good part of this show, and why I think that it came to stand out, where other things that may be better written and handles their interpretations of the Shonen Jump formula much better and with more balance, maybe didn't stand out. And that is that this thing has an incredible, like, metal vibe. Look of the blood powers, the way they treat them, it has a very, like, metal album cover vibe. The other thing that strikes me is that the opening is an incredibly strong opening, but it's got an incredibly fun and dedicated to its own bit, very relevant ending sequence. The ending sequence for this thing is incredible, actually. It's all of the Oni characters doing the same TikTok dance, only they switch between all of the different characters, and it's all done in the perspective of them in street clothes, and meaning streetwear, and on their phones. And with each character, with some of the characters, they give you a little something, like with Kunia, who actually, the show ends on her dance. She has this very, like, get herself hyped up for a fight, for, like, a cage match situation happening. And it has so much personality and so much swagger and so much of what I think this show wants to have in the main content of it, but just doesn't get there. And part of the reason I talked about this when I've been on this, like, specifically of, like, trigger stuff lately, which, by the way, shout out, go read my interview with Imaishi and Wakabayashi over on bento-box.ghost.io. But why I want to talk about this is because we don't get this very often. Even with the tons of, actually that's not true. We don't get this in a way that goes wide very often, in my experience. Or maybe we do and I'm just not seeing it. But this show is so misguided. Even though technically, like, raw rules of it, not doing anything wrong. It's just execution isn't up to par. And also the like, mishandling of the etchiness possible in the show feels like there's something being lost here. It feels from Black Clover to now Tougen Anki. It feels like there's some form of, like, to execute kind of throwaway etchy jokes that's being lost over time. That's not being properly interpreted over time. And I think that's probably because of a lack of, because if you look at, again, a much better show, Dan is a shonen action show through and through. But the thing that separates it is when the author's editor first read, like, the kind of draft of what the mangaka wanted to do, he said, "This is great, but there's nothing to hook you, but I have an idea. Go out and read 100 shoujo romance series." And he did. Or so the story goes, he did. He took those influences and poured them into his show. So much of what you're seeing in shonen now isn't just drawing from shonen. And that's really where I think this show falters, is that it's not drawing from enough. If you look at Jujutsu Kaisen, is drawing from a long history of horror anime and of shonen anime and like self to a point over and over and over again. And in doing that, it's learning lessons about what a good female character looks like, what a truly terrifying villain looks like. If you look at even things like Naruto, Sasuke existed before Naruto in the form of a show called Sasuke, which is actually being released by Anime Ego soon, I think. It's also a kind of reinterpretation of Killua from Hunter x Hunter. You know, Hunter itself is a deconstruction of your typical shonen action show from one of the best to ever do it in the form of Togashi's other most famous work, Yu Yu Hakusho. There is this like give and take among all the big shonen creators of interpretation and of borrowing and stealing from each other's works, but Tougen Anki doesn't get there. And I think that actually Black Clover, as much as it's not my thing, does get there. And a lot of it has to do with the main character. I don't think the main character is actually that important to the formula, believe it or not. I think that the side characters are critical to it. You don't have side characters in this who feel well balanced or like could take much scrutiny. And the pieces it's working with aren't made its own enough to have the effect that interpretation has in other more successful shonen properties. Really what I'm going to leave it today. If you like this episode, new episodes of the podcast come out every Thursday. Really like the show, be sure to like and subscribe. That's possible either here on YouTube or if you're listening to this in your podcast app of choice. And if you really want to explore more of what I do, you can go over to bento-box.ghost.io. The link for that is in the description of the podcast if you're listening to me right now. It's also in the description of the YouTube channel. So you can go over to the YouTube channel and click that. You can also find all the different places to follow me and interact with me over on bento-box.ghost.io. Until next time, I have been Alex, and this has been Bento Radio, and I will talk to you later.